Tonight, we begin with something close to all of us: sleep. Not the kind measured by fitness trackers or interrupted by glowing screens, but the quiet, candlelit kind that once ruled the medieval night. Long before electricity, before alarms and sleep apps, people slept differently. Their nights were not shaped by one long stretch of unconsciousness, but by something more ancient, more natural: segmented sleep. It worked like this. As the sun sank beneath the trees and fires dimmed to soft embers, families would retire early. This was the first sleep, deep, calm, and lasting a few hours. But then, without panic, without reason to worry, they would wake. Not for a bathroom break or insomnia, but because that was simply how nights were lived. This midnight wakefulness was known as the watch. During it, people would tend to quiet tasks. They might add logs to the fire, murmur a prayer, or step outside to check on livestock, because nothing disrupts your dreams like wondering if the goat has escaped again. Some used this time for intimacy, as medical texts of the day suggested. The body was calm, and the mind unburdened, perhaps too tired to argue. When the waking hour passed, they'd return to bed, entering the second sleep. This sleep was longer, often richer in dreams, and carried them into the soft light of morning. Monks, farmers, and even poets like Chaucer lived by this rhythm. In fact, medieval literature casually refers to both first sleep and second sleep, as if everyone knew and accepted it. Modern scientists have since suggested this cycle may be closer to our natural circadian rhythm. So, if you find yourself awake at 2 a.m., don't be alarmed. Just whisper softly, "The watch has begun," and let yourself drift. Now, let's talk about beds. Or rather, what counted as beds in the medieval world. Today, we obsess over mattresses, thread count, cooling foam, and sleep positions. Back then, a bed was anything soft enough not to bruise your bones. For most people, this meant straw. A simple pallet made of hay, if you were lucky, was stuffed into a sack of rough cloth. If not, it was just straw on the ground, sometimes damp, sometimes home to a neighborhood cat. You shared it with whatever had crawled in before you. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even clean. But it was better than nothing. Straw was warm, cheap, and good at keeping out the cold. It was also excellent at attracting insects, fleas, lice, the occasional mouse. So you slept still, scratched less, and hoped for the best. Families with a few more coins, or fewer sore backs, might lift the straw off the ground using a wooden frame. It didn't change the comfort level, but it made beetles in your ear slightly less likely. Linen sheets? A luxury. Most people slept in the same clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't a thing. And forget personal space. Families slept together, parents, children, maybe even a grandparent, all tangled on the same straw mat. If it got too hot, you could roll into your cousin's elbow for ventilation. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. Feather mattresses, wooden frames, sheets embroidered with flowers, and draped canopies to keep out cold air and wandering lice. Their beds were prized possessions, so valuable they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy featherbed. For most people in the medieval world, a bed wasn't a haven of comfort. It was simply a place not to freeze. A pile of straw to escape the damp stone floor. A shared space to avoid the cold, the chickens, and, on rare occasions, to dream of someday sleeping on something that didn't rustle or squawk. And yet, even in such modest nights, there was something soft, almost whimsical: the nightcap. Today, a nightcap brings to mind a warm drink, perhaps whiskey by the fire, something cozy, maybe even reckless. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was not a beverage. It was a hat. A very real, often absurdly shaped piece of fabric, tied or drooped over one's head for one simple purpose: to keep it from freezing. You see, medieval homes weren't known for their insulation. With thatched roofs, stone walls, and windows made of oiled parchment or thin horn, the cold crept in with every gust of wind. Central heating? That would have been the family dog, curled at your feet. And so, they wore hats to bed. These caps came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic looked like something a chimney-sweeping wizard might wear. Long, pointed, and handmade from wool, linen, or any scrap warm enough not to upset the household goat. For men, it was a humble tool. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or wrap, preserving modesty and hiding hair that hadn't seen soap since the last holy festival. And beyond warmth, nightcaps also spoke of status. In some regions, married women covered their heads even in sleep. Caps were embroidered, dyed, even flaunted, tiny flags of family fortune resting atop dreams. In towns, opening a door while wearing your nightcap was the medieval version of saying, "I'm off duty." The hat meant, no conversation, no business, and yes, please go away. Sleepwear, as a whole, wasn't about elegance. Picture long tunics, loose-fitting and often scratchy. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the haunted moral lesson. Nightshirts were practical, flammable, and rarely flattering. Now, imagine sleeping not just in itchy cloth, but next to a stranger. In medieval Europe, that wasn't strange at all. It was expected. If you were a merchant, a wandering pilgrim, or simply someone whose mule had called it quits halfway to Norwich, and you found yourself at an inn, a rare treasure, you wouldn't be given a private room or a clean mattress. You'd get a space in a bed. A bed already occupied. These inns were more bunkhouse than hotel. Privacy wasn't just scarce, it was unnecessary. If there was room on the bed, someone else would share it with you. A stranger. Maybe two. Maybe three. Whether they snored, talked in their sleep, or arrived with an alarming number of boils, none of it mattered. You simply shared, as resources allowed. In cities, sleeping arrangements looked more like dormitories, rows of bodies, shoulder to shoulder, snoring in harmony or in protest. Elbow wars were fought silently. Sometimes in sordid sleepers by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and thieves, well, allegedly, with other thieves. But mostly, it was whoever arrived first. To us, it might sound dreadful. To them, it was better than wolves. Still, they were careful. Travelers tied purses to their belts or hid coins under clothes. Others turned luggage into pillows, both cushion and early warning system. If your bag moved, it probably meant you were about to become slightly poorer. But no matter your class, going to bed in the Middle Ages wasn't just about sleep. It was a spiritual act. A moment of risk. People didn't just tuck in. They prepared, because each night was a tiny death. Illness, fire, demons, or simply being 30 in the year 1247, any of these might claim you before dawn. So they prayed. They recited psalms. They whispered confessions not for comfort, but for clearance. Not because they wanted peace, but because they feared what waited if they didn't wake up. In the medieval world, nighttime wasn't just for rest, it was also for reckoning. The day might have ended, but the soul's worries had just begun. People believed you could die at any moment, quietly in your sleep. From illness, from fire, from demons, or more realistically, simply from the cruel arithmetic of age. To be over 30 in the year 1247 was to already tempt fate. And so, before laying their heads on straw or feathers, they prayed. Not out of peace, but out of fear. A popular prayer whispered by many, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet at first, until you realize it's a child's version of a legal will, acknowledging that bedtime might be your final act. Adults had whole collections of prayers. One for guilt. One for when you feared the devil in the rafters. One for plague prevention, which didn't age particularly well. Some even prayed to saints who specialized in sleep protection. Heavenly guardians, standing quietly like spiritual bouncers at the gates of dreams. For monks and nuns, the day ended with Compline, the final prayer service. Afterward came a vow of silence. Not difficult, really. Most were already tired, hungry, and just a little afraid of the dark. Children were also taught to pray before bed. Not just for their souls, but to keep them occupied, anything to distract from questions like, "Why is there a goat in my blanket again?" Parents reminded them, "The angels are watching," which sounds lovely, until you imagine it more like a celestial security system, blinking silently in the night. Prayer before sleep, then, wasn't for serenity. It was last-minute damage control. A kind of medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. Now let's drift into dreams. Today, we treat them lightly, random bits of cheese-fueled nonsense. But back then, dreams were messages. Some divine, some dangerous. To dream was to receive something. A whisper from God, a warning from a saint, a trick from the devil, or maybe just a lingering effect from that strange relic you kissed at church last week. Dreams had to be taken seriously. You might write them down, confess them, even fast for 3 days, just to be safe. Whole texts were written to decode the symbols. Fire meant hell. Water could mean purification, or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? Best to call a priest. Immediately. And maybe move. Because even when the body slept, the soul was believed to roam freely. Your dreams weren't just fiction. They were confessions, signs of sin or grace. Even dreaming of stealing bread might point to gluttony, or maybe you were just hungry. Still, better confess. Just in case. Monks and nuns recorded their dreams and shared them with their spiritual mentors. Some were praised for holy visions. Others were gently told to avoid onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't only sermons in disguise. They also made excellent stories. Medieval books were full of them. Knights wandering dreamlands, speaking with angels, encountering allegories in the shape of beasts. It was Netflix for the soul, just with fewer happy endings and far more symbolism. The church, cautious as ever, remained skeptical. Not all dreams were divine. Some were temptations planted by demons. A troubling dream might mean your soul was under attack. Or perhaps you just fell asleep too close to the fire again. Now, for something warmer, literally. Today, letting your pet sleep in bed is a cozy, if slightly smelly, choice. In medieval times, it was strategy. In peasant homes, animals shared the room, and often the bed. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up beside your feet. A pig might snore softly near the hearth. If no one bit you during the night, it was a good night. This wasn't sentiment. It was survival. Animals gave off warmth. They didn't complain. And unlike your siblings, they didn't steal the blanket. In those long winters, warmth was a matter of survival, not comfort. And in many humble homes, the solution had 4 legs and fur. A large dog curled at your feet could keep your toes from turning to ice. A cow in the corner might nudge the room temperature up by a few precious degrees. In January, that felt like a miracle. Most medieval homes, especially those of peasants, had just one room. One space for cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes, for saying goodbye. Everyone, human and animal alike, shared that space. Children might be nestled between their parents and a goat. Chickens often acted as noisy, feathered alarm clocks. Hygiene? Best not to dwell on it. Of course, wealthier families didn't sleep beside livestock. at least not the larger kind. Nobles might allow a lapdog in bed, not for warmth, but as a fashionable companion, and inadvertently, a traveling flea circus. Some castles even had separate sleeping quarters for prized animals. Because, truly, nothing whispered power like a dog with its own room and a Latin name. But animals were not without flaws. They were loud. They wandered. They did not understand personal space. And so, a hoof to the face at 3 a.m. was simply part of the nightly routine. Now, imagine a place colder still. Stricter. Quieter. Where comfort was a sin, and softness a temptation. Welcome to the monastery dormitory. Imagine a room filled with rows of wooden planks, barely resembling beds, arranged in perfect lines. Dozens of monks, wrapped in rough robes, sleeping fully clothed. Not out of modesty, but because changing at 2 a.m. was harder than just surrendering to the cold in what you were already wearing. Their robes, belts, and sandals served as both uniform and poor insulation. If you were cold, you added layers. If you were hot, well, that wasn't really allowed. There were no pillows, no curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, written into the rule of Saint Benedict. A groan too loud might earn you chamber pot duty. Snoring? Technically forgiven, but if it woke others, the Lord might not be the only one judging you. Only one candle lit the room. You didn't need to see, just to lie still and not sin. It wasn't sleep. It was discipline. A kind of spiritual training for the afterlife. The denial of flesh prepared the soul. Some monks even slept upright, backs against walls, avoiding any suggestion of luxury. Compared to this, a peasant's straw pile, complete with pig, almost sounded indulgent. At least the pig didn't care if you twitched in your sleep. And then, the bell. Not the kind you snooze. At 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, it rang, cold and clear through the stone corridors. The beginning of Matins, the first prayer service of the day. Though day was a stretch. Even the owls weren't sure if they were awake yet. Monks and nuns, sleep-deprived and silent, rose in their robes and filed into the chapel. Still clothed, still half-dreaming, they lit candles and stood beneath vaulted ceilings, whispering psalms into the darkness. Falling asleep was a real concern. Records exist of monks dozing during prayers, punished gently with extra chores, or more prayers. Fall asleep in Matins? Congratulations, you now lead the next one. Some services lasted an hour. Others, 2. Imagine trying to remain devout while your belly reminded you that dinner was lentils and a lecture, and your body begged to shut down. Afterward, some monks would return to their wooden planks for second sleep. Others? Straight into labor or study. Because nothing says spiritual discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. Why so early? Because they believed the night belonged to God. Why wake at 2 a.m., shivering in robes, just to chant prayers into the darkness? Because, in the minds of the devout, the first and quietest part of the night belonged to God. A time untouched by the noise of daylight, unspoiled by warmth or comfort. It was sacrifice in its softest form, fighting drowsy limbs, sore feet, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting, all for the sacred rhythm of divine discipline. Once you got past the numb toes and flickering candle smoke, it was a powerful symbol of devotion. Or, at least, a test of endurance. Now consider how we think of sleep today. Sleeping alone? A luxury. A peaceful sign of independence. Your own bed, your own blanket, your own playlist of rain sounds or whale songs. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping alone was strange. Suspicious even. Let's begin with the basics. Warmth. Medieval beds weren't cozy. Stone walls, leaky roofs, and smoky chimneys offered no comfort against winter's breath. So people slept together, not for intimacy, but for survival. Children slept beside siblings, parents, and whoever else happened to be in the house. Cousins visiting from the next village? They joined too. It was less a sleepover and more thermal teamwork. The medieval night was a spiritual danger zone. People believed the dark was when devils did their best work. Alone in bed, your soul might be more vulnerable to temptation, to haunting, to possession. But with others nearby, you had witnesses. A moral buffer. If the devil came for you, someone might catch him in the act, or at least scream loudly enough to wake the goat. For children, solitary sleep was nearly unthinkable. Ghosts, spirits, and fairies were not bedtime myths. They were part of the nightly air. Parents didn't tell sweet bedtime stories. They offered warnings. Don't sleep alone. Don't leave the fire unguarded. Don't let the shadows get too close. Even married couples rarely slept by themselves. Children, servants, and even unexpected guests often ended up in the same bed. Privacy wasn't a value, it was an invention that hadn't happened yet. The idea of two people in a giant bed alone would have seemed either suspicious or embarrassingly wasteful. In monasteries, monks also slept communally. If you were told to sleep alone, it wasn't a privilege, it was punishment. You were separated not for rest, but for correction. So next time you fall asleep alone in a clean room, wrapped in silence and modern linens, be grateful. In medieval times, you'd likely have a cousin snoring beside you, a dog at your feet, and at least one child kicking you in the ribs. But not everyone lay flat to sleep. Some medieval folks, especially nobles and particularly strict monks, chose to sleep sitting up. Yes, sitting up. Why? For one, they believed lying down disrupted the body's internal balance. It might affect digestion, breathing, or even the flow of bodily humors. Don't drown in your own phlegm, they might have warned, genuinely worried that reclining could cause fluid to pool in dangerous ways. Secondly, there were spiritual concerns. To lie flat resembled death. It was the pose of corpses, of burial, of final rest. And in the dark, who's to say an angel wouldn't confuse your slumber with your soul's departure? Superstitious? Certainly. But when your priest was also your doctor, and your neighbor believed a sneeze could shift your soul, you learned to sleep cautiously. Wealthier people sometimes propped themselves up with large bolsters. Beds were angled. Headboards were high. A half-seated pose allowed for late-night digestion and presumably easier defense against surprise demonic encounters. Monks took it further. In strict orders, they slept sitting upright on benches, sometimes leaning against walls. No mattress. No cushion. Just woolen robes and cold stone. This wasn't about sleep, it was about discipline. Comfort bred dreams. Dreams led to temptation. Temptation led to confession at 5 a.m. Rest wasn't for pleasure. It was a battleground. Sleep in the medieval world was rarely peaceful. Sure, the night might be quiet, no car alarms, no phones buzzing beside your ear, but peace? That's another matter entirely. Because medieval bedrooms had their own kind of nighttime noise. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the unwelcome king of them all, the bedbug. Let's not pretend otherwise. Hygiene was not exactly medieval Europe's shining trait. Baths were rare. Laundry was expensive. Soap? Sometimes made from ingredients you wouldn't dare whisper near a dinner table. Combine that with straw-stuffed mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you had the perfect recipe for an itchy, twitchy night. Fleas and lice weren't visitors. They were housemates. Peasants dealt with them daily. Nobles, too, no matter how satin their sheets or how feathered their pillows. Some aristocratic homes even employed nitpickers, Yes, real humans whose job was to remove lice from their master's head and clothing. Imagine waking up, stretching, and heading to your job as master of the royal scalp. Then came the bedbugs, tiny vampires of the night. They nestled in wooden frames, seams of mattresses, even cracks in stone walls, waiting for darkness to fall before they emerged to feed. People tried everything. Burning herbs like wormwood or tansy, known for their pungent smell. Sleeping with garlic or onion beside the bed, not exactly romantic, but maybe effective. Some families even sprinkled ashes between the sheets. It didn't chase away fleas, but it certainly discouraged guests. And strangely, fleas became symbols of sin, of impurity, of poor choices, both moral and bedding related. Entire poems were written about them. Some pious, some, oddly enough, romantic. One old verse read, "Let us be united like the flea that bites us both." Perhaps not the most swoon-worthy of metaphors, but sincere. So while we struggle with blue light and late emails, medieval sleep was broken by scratching, shifting, and the unnerving knowledge that, yes, something was crawling up your leg. Because it was. But if you think that's uncomfortable, try falling asleep in armor. Yes, armor. While it wasn't common to snore inside a full suit of iron, there were times, especially during war, when knights and soldiers chose protection over comfort. A knight on campaign might remove his helmet and gloves, but leave on his breastplate or chain mail, just in case the enemy came knocking. Comfort? Optional. Survival? Preferred. But sleep in armor was a challenge. Chainmail pinched. Breastplates didn't breathe. And the sound? One roll too far to the left, and you'd clank so loudly your comrades might think the gates of hell had opened. Again. Even travelers sometimes slept in padded jackets, called gambesons. They weren't armored, but thick enough to absorb a blade, or at least the sharp side of a scolding. So while today's question is soft or firm mattress, theirs was breastplate or boiled leather. And in the dark there were others. Sleepwalkers. In our world, they're the slightly eerie stars of home videos or gentle stories. But back then, a sleepwalker wasn't a confused person. They were bewitched. Possessed. Perhaps haunted by a sin they hadn't confessed. Or cursed by someone they wronged. Or maybe they just ate bad cheese. The idea of someone silently rising from bed, eyes wide and empty, wandering across a room in the moonlight, it wasn't a quirk. It was terrifying. There are stories. People speaking Latin in their sleep, unaware. Chanting things they didn't know. Reaching out toward nothing. Or even walking into forests and rivers, never seen again. The medieval mind didn't call this a disorder. It called it a warning. Sleepwalking was a glimpse, they thought, into another world. A rehearsal. A possession. A message. So if someone stirred too often at night, families whispered. And if they walked too far? Well, not everyone woke up where they began. Sleepwalking in the medieval world was not a harmless quirk. It was, to many, a sign of sin of spirits or something far worse. Picture it, a man in a long linen nightshirt, candle flickering in hand, his eyes open but vacant, mumbling Latin he never learned. He steps over a dozing chicken. He brushes past the child asleep on a straw mat. He reaches for something invisible. You'd think ghost. Or heretic. Or both. And depending on the mood of the local priest, he might just schedule an exorcism before breakfast. Sleepwalking was unsettling. It was unexplained. And that made it dangerous. Some physicians blamed it on bad humors, especially black bile, which was the catch-all cause for anything mysterious or unpleasant. Others thought the soul had simply drifted too far during sleep, leaving the body to wander like an unchaperoned mule. To prevent these nightly excursions, people tried what they had: prayers. Hanging iron charms above the bed. Whispered blessings before sleep. And, in rural corners of the world, more practical methods, like tying the sleepwalker's leg to a chair. That might sound extreme, but consider this. Medieval homes had open fires, knives left out, ladders leaning casually against walls, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically kicked over. There were tales, too, of sleepwalkers scaling rooftops, whispering secrets to the moon, or attempting to fly. Whether true or merely the kind of thing whispered by firelight, the fear was real. Could you sin while unconscious? Could you speak with devils in your dreams? And if you walked into a church, barefoot and wide-eyed in the night, was that a miracle? Or a warning? Some said it was a message from God. Others weren't so sure. But even for those who didn't roam in their sleep, bedtime in the Middle Ages was rarely silent. Chaos hummed in the background. And people learned, somehow, to sleep through it. Let's begin with bells. Church bells rang for everything. Sunrise. Morning prayers. Work time. Meals. Vespers. Matins. Midnight vigils. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams were layered with tolls and chimes, echoing across stone walls and tiled roofs. At first, it might have startled you, but eventually your brain surrendered. Bells became the lullaby of a soul stretched thin. And storms? They were not gentle. With no weather forecasts, no double-glazed windows, no sealed chimneys, every thunderclap felt like the start of something biblical. Roofs leaked. Windows rattled. Wind howled down corridors like spirits calling out names. Still, people slept. Because they had to. Sleep wasn't optional. It was essential. Plowing fields didn't wait for insomnia. Feeding animals, hauling water, surviving taxes, none of it paused for a restless night. Even invasions didn't always interrupt bedtime. When Viking raids were common, some villages learned to keep boots near the bed, axes within reach, but still, they slept. They couldn't afford not to. And when the Black Death swept through Europe, people slept while neighbors perished. Death carts rolled by at dawn. Wails echoed through narrow alleys. And still, somehow, the body collapsed, exhausted, into unconsciousness. Sleep was both an act of resilience and of surrender. To be human was to need rest, no matter the ruin outside your door. There are records of people sleeping through earthquakes, through barn fires, through riots and revolts. Because when you spent each day working from dawn to dusk, eating little, and dodging everything from disease to divine judgment, sleep came like a hammer. It was heavy. It was fast. And it was often the only escape. In fact, some people sought sleep deliberately, not just to rest, but to hide. In the face of grief, famine, or fear that the world was ending, again, they curled beneath a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and let themselves drift away. In sleep, there were no landlords, no dying cows, no sermons, only silence. Once upon a quiet evening in 1692, in a little New England village shrouded in snow and superstition, something strange began to stir. A young girl began to convulse, shaking, muttering, clutching at her throat as if some unseen force had wrapped itself around her. Another girl followed. Then another. The household, belonging to Reverend Samuel Parris, had seen unrest before. But this was different. Witchcraft. That single word changed everything. The townsfolk of Salem already lived in uneasy rhythms, praying by day, locking doors by night. They believed the devil was real, and that he could reach them not as a horned beast, but as a whisper, a sickness, a woman standing too quietly by the fire. And now, If the devil could touch the daughters of the town minister, then no home was safe. No soul was certain. The girls, watched and worried over, began to name names. They didn't start with the powerful or the wealthy. No, first came those already forgotten by the village. The lonely. The poor. The strange. One woman muttered to herself when turned away at doorsteps. Another hadn't come to church in months and had dared to marry her servant. One smoked a pipe. Another raised her voice at children. Small things. But in a village hungry for reasons, they were enough. Then came Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household, brought from faraway Barbados. Her stories were rich with rhythm, her accent thick, her knowledge of spirits and creatures foreign to New England ears. Under pressure, some say threats, others suggest worse, Tituba confessed. She told them she had seen a man in black. A tall figure who carried a book, who asked her to sign her name. She had seen birds, yellow, red, black, and dogs with eyes like coals. And, she said, there were others? Other witches. It didn't matter whether her tale was truth, imagination, or survival. It was all the court needed. Once the gate was open, the river could not be held back. The girls grew more certain. Louder. They fell into fits. They screamed at invisible beasts during prayer. In the courtroom, they convulsed, shouted, gasped, and pointed fingers. Neighbors began to whisper about one another. Old arguments over fences became accusations of curses. If a cow died suddenly, it was no longer fate. It was a hex. If a child cried during a hymn, clearly a demon stirred nearby. And if someone tried to defend the accused, they too were cast under suspicion. It became safer to say nothing, safer to nod, safer to let the storm grow. And so the storm did. Eventually, the colonial government took notice. Governor William Phipps arrived with orders and worry. He created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meant to bring order, but built on shaky ground. This court didn't rely on facts or proof as we know them. It welcomed a new kind of evidence. Spectral evidence. It meant that if someone claimed they saw your ghost, or your shadowy form, in a dream, tormenting them, that was enough. You could be miles away, asleep, at prayer. Still, your spirit might be guilty. And how do you cross-examine a dream? How do you prove you didn't haunt someone's sleep? Children now stood as witnesses in a court of law. Their cries became louder, their performances more elaborate. One girl fainted every time an accused woman entered the room. Another would scream when looked at, and scream even louder when not looked at. It wasn't madness. It was theater. A dangerous, sacred, contagious kind of theater. And the judges, some godly, some frightened, some ambitious, watched and listened, and nodded, and wrote down names. Outside, the snow still fell. Candles burned low in quiet homes, and families whispered prayers that they would wake without someone knocking at the door, or speaking their name aloud in court. The darkness was no longer safe. Not because of shadows, but because of what people believed lived inside them. The courtroom was quiet, a breath held, a sentence written, and Chief Justice William Stoughton accepted it all. There were no defense lawyers. The concept didn't exist in colonial courts. If you were accused, you stood alone. Deny the charges? The girls would collapse, scream, writhe in imaginary pain. Confess? You might be spared death, if you named others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. And still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from nearby villages, curious or eager, to watch them unfold. The accused were paraded into the courtroom in shackles, bewildered, often poor, almost always powerless. But not everyone believed. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking. Others questioned why certain types of people were always accused. But few dared speak aloud. Because questioning the court meant questioning the will of God. And in Salem, reason had quietly stepped aside. Justice became a mirror, reflecting fear instead of truth. On June 10, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was not new to scandal. Her bright red clothing, her tavern, her bold voice. Years earlier, she'd been accused of witchcraft. It made her an easy target. At her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them in the night. That their babies had died after she passed by. That she kept enchanted dolls. Bridget denied everything. It didn't matter. The court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a bare, windswept patch of earth outside the village. There were no final prayers. No mercy. Only the rope, the wooden frame, and the eyes of a watching crowd. The rope was pulled, and the machinery of death began. On July 19th, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had good standing in the church. Rebecca Nurse's execution shocked many. An elderly woman, kind and devout. Initially, the jury found her not guilty. But the afflicted girls protested. The court wavered. The verdict was reversed. Rebecca's final words floated into the air like a whisper: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." It didn't matter. The news had no sense of irony. August brought more names. More rope. More bodies buried in unmarked soil. Then came September 22nd. The deadliest morning of all. 8 executions. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who faced a different fate. Giles refused to plead, refused to say guilty, refused to say innocent. The court, unable to proceed without a plea, turned to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. They pressed him. Stones stacked upon his chest. Slowly. Giles did not break. His final words, legend says, were simple: more weight. By the end, 19 people had been hanged. 1 man pressed to death. At least 5 others died in jail. Over 200 people were accused. Dozens confessed falsely, hoping to survive. The gallows cast shadows, not just on the hilltop, but across every soul in Salem. Fear had become law. Justice had been blindfolded and led to the scaffold. And what of those who waited? Hundreds more sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails. Too many for Salem to hold. Accused witches were shipped to nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston. There, chained to stone walls, they waited. Cold. Hungry. Forgotten. Most were not witches. Nor rebels. Nor criminals. Grudges, they learned, could wear holy robes. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. Witchcraft. Someone refused to lend firewood. Cursed. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, was one of them. A respected mother of 7. Kind. Pious. Initially released by the court, she was rearrested days later after new fits from the girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final petition, Mary didn't beg for her life. She begged for the court to stop. To end the trials before more innocent blood was shed. She was hanged soon after. Elizabeth Proctor was spared, not from judgment, but from the noose. She was pregnant, and so the law demanded delay. That delay likely saved her life. She would give birth in jail, cradled by chains and candlelight. And when the madness passed, she would walk free. But many others would not. The spiral deepened. Some accused confessed. only to name others, hoping, perhaps, that guilt could be passed like a sickness. Entire families found themselves trapped. Fathers, wives, daughters, all caught in the wide net of suspicion. Meanwhile, the jails filled beyond reason. There was barely room to sit. Food was short. Disease crept in. Some died before ever setting foot in court. And still the accusations came. Names scrawled in ink. Whispers behind doors. Fingers pointing in church pews. In Salem, your innocence no longer mattered. Only your ability to remain unnoticed did. But hysteria, like a storm, cannot rage forever. By the fall of 1692, something shifted. The spell began to crack, not out of sudden reason, but necessity. Reality forced its way in, like light through a shutter. One moment turned the tide. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested. A well-spoken man, educated and once respected, though not without enemies. That was enough. The court claimed he was the ringleader of the witches. But on the day of his hanging, he did something no witch was thought able to do. He recited the Lord's Prayer. Clearly. Perfectly. The crowd, once hardened by fear, grew still. Some wept. It didn't stop the execution. But something changed. The public saw the rope, saw the prayer, and questioned the story they'd been told. Then came another name. Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps. When she, too, was accused, hysteria finally reached the top. Governor Phipps, uneasy for weeks and now alarmed, acted. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The hanging stopped. No more trials. No more death sentences. No more shrieking in courtrooms passed off as truth. The spell had broken. Voices once silent began to speak. Increase Mather, a powerful clergyman, condemned the use of spectral evidence. It were better, he said, that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned. A radical idea, in a land that had done the opposite for months. But the people listened. And for the first time, they agreed. By the end of 1692, Salem was not healed, but stunned. The trials didn't end with fire and brimstone. They ended with silence. The jails were still full. But no one wanted more names. No one wanted more graves. Instead, they wanted distance. In early 1693, a new court formed, the Superior Court of Judicature. This one didn't allow spectral evidence. The judges? Sharper. Wiser. Worn down. Accusations slowed. Confessions faded. The girls' performances lost their power. No more collapsing in court. No more cries from invisible wounds. Truth had returned, if only in quiet steps. 56 cases stood before the new court. Most ended in freedom. Even those who had confessed began to recant. They spoke of pressure, of threats, of confusion. Some said nothing, just closed their eyes and waited for the nightmare to pass. But the damage, it had already been done. Reputation, trust, community, all had suffered. Churches divided. Families were ruined. The village was no longer one voice, but many, each whispering guilt. Some wept for justice. Others tried to forget. And the land itself seemed quieter, as if ashamed. Governor Phipps, under pressure from the crown, issued pardons for the remaining prisoners. They walked free. But they carried something with them that no rope could erase. Memory. Freedom came slowly to Salem, and it came with a cost. The accused, those who had survived the cold stone floors and whispered prayers in jail, were not simply released with apologies. Many had to pay for their own imprisonment. Imagine, you lose your health, your home, nearly your life, and then receive a bill for the privilege of surviving. And so they stepped back into a village no longer the one they remembered. 19 hanged. 1 pressed to death. 5 more lost to sickness behind bars. Over 200 accused. The courts had collapsed, not with a roar, but with a kind of shameful sigh, leaving behind a crater of doubt and grief. The hangings were over. But the healing hadn't even begun. Salem was no longer haunted by witches. It wasn't ghosts that lingered at the edges of fields and hearth fires. It was memories. The feeling of having pointed, nodded, whispered. Or worse, done nothing. What had begun with a handful of strange fits had spread like fire, and in the aftermath, neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. Families had been torn in two. Reputations ruined. Trust, once stitched into the fabric of village life, now lay frayed on every doorstep. The afflicted girls, once center stage, drifted away. Some moved. Some faded. One, and Putnam Jr., did something rare. She stood before her church in 1706 and apologized. She blamed the devil for deceiving her, for twisting truth into shadow. Some forgave her. Judge Samuel Sewall, respected, powerful, chose to stand during a Sunday service in 1697. There, as the congregation watched, a minister read aloud his public confession. He had erred. He asked for forgiveness. It was not enough to undo what had been done. But it was something. A single act of accountability, like the first drop of rain on scorched earth. Families of the condemned began to write, to demand, to plead. Petitions poured into the Massachusetts government, requesting formal pardons, the return of property, the restoration of names. In 1711, years after the gallows had fallen silent, the colony passed a bill restoring the honor of some of the dead and offering small sums to their heirs. But not all. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left with nothing but memory and bitterness. The silence of those excluded was as deafening as the apologies offered. Over time, the village of Salem changed its name to Danvers. Perhaps to escape the shadow. Perhaps to suggest a new start. But Gallows Hill remained. Never marked. Never honored. As if the land itself hoped to forget. Still, it remembered. The soil didn't speak. But it held the footprints of fear. The weight of judgment. And the silence between former friends. Witchcraft never truly returned to New England. But in Salem, the shame became part of the place. Not as a curse, but as a lesson. It was not witches who had damned the village. It was pride. It was fear. And it was power unchecked. More than 300 years later, the story of Salem echoes, not as distant thunder, but as a whisper of warning. The trials were not just a strange moment of mass hysteria. They were a failure. A collapse of reason, compassion, and justice. A reminder of how quickly belief can become weapon. Of how silence becomes complicity. Ordinary people, farmers, ministers, wives, became part of a system that killed. Not out of malice, but out of fear. It didn't take devils. It only took belief in them. And so Salem, long after the fires cooled, helped forge something stronger. When the U.S. Constitution was written, nearly a century later, it bore quiet fingerprints of Gallows Hill. The right to a fair trial. The right to confront your accuser. The demand for real evidence. All born, in part, from those silent shadows. Today, witch hunt is often said as metaphor. A phrase thrown around casually. But Salem was not a metaphor. It was a village. A place where people were hanged for imaginary crimes. Betrayed not by witches, but by belief. When the embers of Salem cooled, the world moved on. But elsewhere, in a land of marble columns and political ambition, Another story quietly unfolded, a story not of witches, but of will. Around 83 BC, in the grand and unpredictable Roman Republic, a girl named Fulvia was born. Her family, the Fulvii, wasn't among Rome's oldest, but they had climbed high. Generals, consuls, orators. Their name carried weight. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his clumsy speech than his accomplishments. Bambalio, they called him, stammerer. But his daughter, she did not stammer. She commanded. From the moment Fulvia could walk among the marble courtyards and tiled atriums of her home, she absorbed the rhythm of politics. Senators debated near her. Alliances shifted like sand at her feet. Treachery, ambition, rhetoric, it wasn't just theater. It was life. And Fulvia, even as a child, was watching. In Roman households, elite women were meant to be elegant shadows, educated, yes, but reserved. Loyal, but silent. Fulvia refused the mold. She was brilliant, observant, and perhaps most dangerously, unafraid. When she came of age, the Roman Republic was unraveling. Civil wars flared. Names like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar became fire on the lips of the people. Rome was no longer governed by balance, but by ambition. And Fulvia was not content to watch it burn from the sidelines. She chose to walk into the flames. Her first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, a man as wild as the times themselves. Clodius was no typical noble. He was a populist agitator, a master of spectacle. He once dressed as a woman to crash a sacred female-only ceremony in Caesar's home. Scandal clung to him like perfume. But to Fulvia, Clodius wasn't just a rogue. He was a political weapon. They married in the early 50s BC, forming an alliance that rippled through Rome's crowded streets. Fulvia wasn't just a wife. She became Clodius' confidant, his strategist, his equal. Their home was more than a household, it was a headquarters. Fulvia met with his supporters. She managed funds. She oversaw messages. She was visible, vocal, and effective. Rome had never seen a woman quite like her. But power comes at a price. In 52 BC, Clodius was murdered, ambushed by a rival's guards along the Appian Way. His death shook the city. And Fulvia? She mourned loudly. In an unforgettable act of political theater, she displayed his mutilated body in the forum. His wounds were left uncovered. Her grief was raw, public, and full of purpose. The people gasped. Then they rioted. Fires raged. The Senate house burned. Fulvia had transformed loss into uprising. Her mourning became a movement. Her voice became a weapon. But she was not finished. Not by far. She would marry again, twice more. Not for comfort, but for strategy. Her second husband was Gaius Scribonius Curio, a political firebrand aligned with Julius Caesar. Curio didn't last long. He died during Caesar's civil wars. But Fulvia's third marriage would place her in the very heart of Roman power. Mark Antony. Yes, that Mark Antony. Warrior. Orator. Caesar's loyal friend. And eventually, Fulvia's partner. She didn't shrink behind him. She marched with him. Together, they ruled much of the Roman world. When Antony left for the east, Fulvia remained behind, and led armies in his name. She wasn't just holding down the fort. She was holding the front line. Her enemies called her monstrous. Her supporters called her fearless. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia. A woman who appeared on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. A woman who defied every expectation. Who turned grief into power. Marriage into influence. Silence into history. She wasn't a whisper in someone else's story. She was the author of her own. As Fulvia stood before the crowd with Clodius's blood still fresh in the minds of Romans, she had already rewritten what it meant to be a widow. Most women in her position would have retreated. Fulvia advanced. Her voice did not tremble. Her actions were not for tears, but for transformation. Her first public uprising had worked. But she knew momentum didn't last forever in a city as hungry and dangerous as Rome. So when the fires from Clodius's death cooled, Fulvia looked again to the Senate. Not for approval, but for alignment. Enter her second husband, Gaius Scribonius Curio. A brash, dramatic tribune of the plebs, Curio didn't appear at first to be a wise match. But Fulvia wasn't seeking peace. She was seeking leverage. And Curio had it. As a powerful supporter of Julius Caesar, he was connected to the political earthquake about to erupt across the Republic. Their union wasn't a romance. It was an alliance. Through Curio, Fulvia stayed close to the pulse of power. She helped organize street support, maintained her first husband's networks, and rebranded their cause under this new figurehead. But Rome was no longer on the edge of chaos. It was falling in. In 49 BC, civil war exploded. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and the Republic broke open. Curio took up Caesar's banner, launching a campaign into Africa. Fulvia, from the marble halls of Rome, supported the movement with strategy and presence. But the campaign ended in disaster. Curio was ambushed. Killed. His army crushed. Fulvia had lost her second husband to civil unrest. And once again, she did not fade. Rome watched her, half in awe, half in fear. Twice widowed. Twice undefeated. Her influence had not vanished. It had deepened. The city held its breath. Then, in 47 BC, Fulvia stepped into her most dramatic chapter yet. She married Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. Antony was no gentle soul. He drank, gambled, and loved theatrics. But he was also powerful, fiercely loyal to Caesar, and ascending quickly through military ranks. Fulvia did not marry a soldier. She married a revolution. And Antony? He did not seek a trophy wife. He sought someone who could hold Rome when he was away, someone who understood the mechanics of loyalty, influence, and threat. Fulvia was all that and more. Together, they became Rome's most potent political pair. While Antony fought campaigns abroad, Fulvia governed at home. She read his correspondence, issued directives in his name, sat in political councils, influenced Senate appointments. No Roman woman had ever been so visible in civic power. And for many, that visibility was frightening. The Senate scoffed. Whispers circled that she acted like a man, that she dared to lead meetings, that she coordinated with street enforcers, mobilized crowds, and pulled the strings of influence with the ease of a consul. Fulvia wasn't breaking rules. She was rewriting them. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Rome once again boiled over. Antony rushed to claim his place in the wreckage. And Fulvia? She held the city. She negotiated with factions, secured Antony's interests, and arranged marriages, including offering her own daughter, Claudia, to Octavian to seal a peace between Antony and Caesar's young heir. Fulvia became more than a wife. She became a proxy, a mirror of Antony in the streets of Rome. Her face did not appear on statues of goddesses, but it did appear on coinage. In bold letters, beside Antony's profile, Fulvia's name was minted into bronze. That, in Rome, was almost unthinkable. No woman, not mother, not empress, not priestess, had ever been so declared. But Fulvia was never concerned with precedent. She dealt in futures. And the future was about to test her like never before. For most Roman women, power was fleeting, felt only through sons or husbands. But Fulvia stood under her own sky, in the full light of politics and danger. And when she saw cracks in the alliance between her husband Mark Antony and his rival Octavian, she didn't retreat. She reached for the sword. After Julius Caesar's assassination, Rome was brittle. 3 men ruled in uneasy partnership: Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. The second triumvirate, they called it. But beneath the handshakes and ceremonies, ambition gnawed at the roots. Fulvia sensed what others only whispered: this republic would not survive 2 masters. And Antony, far away in the east, was distracted. So Fulvia acted. She became more than his voice in Rome. She became his protector, his advance guard, his war drum. Alongside Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a sitting consul, Fulvia declared opposition to Octavian's growing power. The pretense was simple: defending the land rights of veterans loyal to Antony. But this wasn't just about property. It was a clash of visions. A civil war, orchestrated by a woman. Fulvia stirred the crowds like a seasoned orator. She promised justice for displaced soldiers, reminding them of Caesar's promises and Octavian's betrayals. She found allies, mustered 8 full legions, and took control of the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. From there, she commanded attention. From there, she challenged a rising emperor. Octavian didn't ignore her. He besieged the city. Through the winter of 41 BC, Perugia froze. Supplies thinned. Morale broke. Fulvia, once at the center of power, now found herself surrounded by enemies outside and by hunger within. Still, she held on. Ancient writers tell us Fulvia had more will to fight than Lucius. That she pushed harder. That she rallied troops, managed messages, and refused surrender until there was no choice. But Rome was not ready. Not for her strength. Not for her audacity. Not for her war. When Perugia finally fell in early 40 BC, Lucius Antonius was spared, likely a political move to avoid enraging Antony. But Fulvia? She was exiled. Sent to Sicyon in Greece. Far from the Senate steps. Far from the armies she once stirred. They called it punishment. But for Fulvia, perhaps it was also relief. For years she had stood behind the curtain of Roman power, pulling strings, braving storms, making history with every step. She had raised armies, shaped alliances, and carved her name into coin and campaign. She was not a symbol. She was a force. But forces that challenge tradition too loudly are often cast out. In exile, Fulvia's health declined. Her letters stopped. Her fire, it seemed, faded not in battle, but in silence. She died later that same year, 40 BC. Not in a blaze of politics or fury, but quietly. Far from the roar of Rome. She left behind no empire, no statue, no sacred text. But she left behind a record that could not be erased. The first woman in Roman history to launch a civil war. The only one to ever try. History, as written by men, tried to scold her. Called her shrill. Reckless. Power-hungry. But beneath the ink is something else. A woman who saw power not as privilege, but as duty. A woman who refused to be quiet. A woman who, when faced with the full weight of empire, did not kneel. She stood. And in standing, Fulvia offered a lesson not just for Rome, but for all time. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to be forgotten. Exile wasn't supposed to be the ending. Fulvia had crossed the sea to Sicyon, a small city in Greece, not in surrender but in expectation. She believed Antony would come. That he would see her loyalty, her struggle, her sacrifice, and respond. But Antony didn't come. The man she had gone to war for, whose name she had defended on banners and in blood, remained absent. In his silence, the depth of Fulvia's gamble came into view. She had acted in his name, but perhaps not with his blessing. The alliance between husband and wife had eroded under the weight of distance, war, and betrayal. Fulvia had made history, waging a civil war as no Roman woman ever had. She had raised legions, occupied cities, defied a rising emperor. And for it, she was sent away. Not with chains, but with silence. Her landing in Sicyon was not a hero's return. It was quiet. A diplomatic exile. A holding self for inconvenient ambition. What she may not have known, what history soon made clear, was that while she prepared armies, Antony had been preparing parties. In Egypt. With Cleopatra. The stories vary. Some say their affair had already begun. Others say it was still budding. But the contrast was brutal. Fulvia had rallied soldiers in snow, while Antony drank wine beside a queen. She had fought Octavian for her husband's power, and he had let her fade into rumor. Some ancient writers, Plutarch among them, suggest Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusian War without his command. Others imply that her failure offered him something he couldn't resist, a clean path toward peace with Octavian. Fulvia would have never tolerated a marriage alliance between Antony and his rival's family. So her absence became an opportunity. Even in exile, Fulvia had loyalists. Soldiers who remembered her boldness. Officers who believed her cause was just. Some urged Antony to meet with her. But her health had begun to fail. Siege. Hunger. Betrayal. Her body bore what history wouldn't acknowledge, the cost of being too powerful, too visible, too soon. In 40 BC, she died in Sicyon. She was around 43. No triumph. No return. No speech in the forum. Just stillness. For Antony, her death was convenient. A moment to reset. Soon after, he traveled to Italy. He met Octavian. The two men, once bitter rivals, clasped hands under the pretense of unity. Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. The second triumvirate was restored. And Fulvia? She was the price. She left behind no memoir, no surviving letters, no final address to the Senate. Only fragments. Mentions and records written by men who preferred her quiet. And so, they rewrote her. Ancient historians described her not as a pioneer, but as a problem. Dio Cassius. Plutarch. Appian. They called her jealous. Ambitious. Overbearing. They blamed her for Antony's failures, the civil unrest, and even the personal bitterness between Rome's leaders. But look closer, and the contradictions emerge. Was Fulvia any more aggressive than Caesar? Any more calculating than Octavian? Did she not play the same game, only with different expectations? In truth, Fulvia's only deviation from Rome's great men was that she was not one. She was a woman commanding armies in the public square. A woman writing to generals, not love letters. A woman organizing elections, street movements, and wartime alliances. A woman who appeared, boldly, on coinage with her name carved into bronze. And Rome did not know what to do with her. So it buried her in silence. Even Antony, whose legacy she had protected, found it easier to blame her than honor her. His reconciliation with Octavian, his new marriage, his political survival, it all flowed more smoothly without Fulvia's name. There was no statue, no funeral speech, no monument in marble. But still, her shadow lingers. She wasn't forgotten. Not completely. Because she had done too much. Raised armies. Shaped alliances. Declared war. And dared to rule in the world of men. Fulvia's story did not end in marble. It lingered, quiet as candlelight, waiting to be rediscovered. She was the first Roman woman to appear on a coin with her own name, the first to orchestrate a civil war, the first to shape political tides not from behind the curtain, but on the battlefield. Her defiance outlived her, buried in records written by those who feared her strength. And yet, she endured. Not as a footnote, but as a force. In the centuries that followed, Rome would remember its emperors and generals, its poets and traders. But Fulvia? She became a myth of a different kind, rebellious, unruly, inconvenient. But if you listen closely, through the crackle of ancient texts, her voice remained. She had tested the boundaries of female power. And though she paid a steep price, she carved a shadow in which other women would later stand. Livia, Agrippina, even Cleopatra. They would command armies, influence succession, and manipulate the empire. But Fulvia did it first. And without a throne. Today, historians look again. Not with scorn, but curiosity. Fulvia is no longer framed as the problem. She is seen as the blueprint. One who dared too much, too soon, in a world that demanded women stay quiet. And while Rome tried to erase her, she left fingerprints on every marble step. Centuries later, in a land oceans away from Rome, another fight stirred. It was no longer about Senate halls or battlefield orders. It was about sidewalks, schools, water fountains, the right to walk without fear. It was the summer of 1963. The United States stood at a crossroads. In the Deep South, segregation was law. Black Americans were denied equal access to restaurants, schools, public spaces, and even the ballot box. Police brutality was rampant. Peaceful protesters were greeted with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and batons. But something had shifted. Change wasn't asking anymore. It was marching. The civil rights movement had already shaken the country. Sit-ins disrupted segregated lunch counters. Freedom riders defied Jim Crow laws on interstate buses. Boycotts weakened businesses built on exclusion. And now, eyes turned to Washington, D.C. The idea wasn't new. Decades earlier, labor leader A. Philip Randolph had proposed a similar march to demand equal treatment in the defense industry. That march was called off when President Roosevelt issued an executive order. But in 1963, the stakes were far greater. And this time, no executive order would quiet the call. Philip Randolph returned, now joined by Bayard Rustin, a brilliant strategist, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a voice that echoed like thunder through pulpits and protest lines alike. Together, they envisioned something monumental. Not just a demonstration. A declaration. They weren't marching for attention. They were marching for jobs. For voting rights. For school integration. For equal pay. For the right to live free from fear. And perhaps most of all, for dignity. More than a dozen civil rights organizations, often fractured in strategy and philosophy, came together under one plan. They knew unity was the key. Their disagreements didn't vanish, but their purpose outweighed them. Buses were organized. Flyers printed. Churches mobilized. Entire communities prepared to move. Not with anger, but with resolve. The countdown had begun. By midsummer 1963, the momentum was unstoppable. The whisper had become a roar. Word of mouth moved faster than newspapers. Church bulletins, community meetings, and neighborhood whispers spread the message like wind in dry grass. Across the United States, from small towns to crowded cities, Black Americans, and many of their allies, were preparing for something historic. Not just a protest, a presence. To organize any march in Washington, D.C. was difficult. To plan one for over 100,000 people, maybe more, sounded like madness. But madness became miracle. Every detail had to be considered: transportation, lodging, food, water, signage, medical support, sound systems, portable toilets, crowd control. Permits had to be secured. Volunteers trained. Timelines refined. And at the center of it all stood Bide Rustin. Rustin, though often kept behind the curtain due to his sexuality, was the architect behind the scenes. A student of Gandhi's methods, a fierce pacifist, a man who had been jailed, beaten, and shadowed by the FBI, Rustin remained undeterred. He knew the power of peaceful precision. In just 8 weeks, he and his team built the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The title was deliberate. It wasn't just about race. It was about opportunity, employment, wages, dignity. Rustin understood: equality without economic justice is a shell. Randolph, Rustin, King. They worked as a chorus, each playing a part. Randolph brought seniority and stature. Rustin the plan. King the voice. Behind them, the big 6 civil rights organizations often disagreed on tactics, speeches, and who would stand where, but they shared one unshakable belief: silence was no longer an option. Meanwhile, President John F. Kennedy's administration braced for the worst. They feared riots, violence, global embarrassment. The National Guard was placed on standby. Hospitals put on alert. Liquor sales banned for the day. Federal workers were told they could stay home. Washington held its breath. August 28, 1963. A humid Wednesday. By 9 a.m., the sun was heavy, the air sticky. But still, they came, by train, by bus, by car, by foot. From Mississippi back roads. From Chicago's South Side. From Harlem, Oakland, Detroit, Mobile. They wore Sunday best. They carried cardboard signs. Some clutched hands, others clutched hope. They came as students, teachers, ministers, factory workers, grandparents. Some came alone. Others came in church groups or with unions. More than 250,000 people, converging like a tide onto the National Mall. But there was no chaos. No stampedes. No broken glass. No fires. Instead, there was song. Volunteers in white armbands guided marchers. The Red Cross handed out water. Gospel choirs sang beside the reflecting pool. Chants of jobs and freedom echoed across the marble steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities came, too, not for glamour, but for solidarity. Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But there were no red carpets. No applause for fame. They stood among the crowd, witnesses to history, not the stars of it. And then, the speaking began. One by one, leaders took the stage. From different regions, races, and ideologies, but unified in demand. They called for equal pay. For an end to police brutality. For desegregated schools. For jobs with dignity. For safety, fairness, and voice. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson lifted her voice beneath the very sky where she had once been banned from singing indoors. It was a day of redemption. A protest turned into poetry. The crowd remained calm, but the energy hummed. For many Black Americans, simply standing on the mall felt revolutionary. To be seen. To be counted. To stand beneath Lincoln's gaze and say, "We are still here." A circle had closed. A new chapter had begun. And as the final speaker prepared to rise, a quiet spread through the crowd. Not from fear, but from reverence. The dream was about to be spoken aloud. The day had been long, filled with songs, signs, and speeches, but the final voice had yet to rise. And when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward, the National Mall hushed. All eyes turned to him, not with celebrity awe, but with sacred anticipation. He spoke first of pain, of injustice unhealed a century after emancipation. The Negro is still not free, he declared, and his words didn't accuse, they testified. He traced a nation's broken promises and lifted the weight of generations into the air. Then something shifted. Prompted by gospel legend Mahalia Jackson's cry, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," King let the page go. What came next was fire in the form of hope. "I have a dream," he said, and the air thickened. He dreamed of freedom rolling down like waters, of black and white children holding hands, of justice taking root in Georgia's red hills, of a country living up to its own creed. Each word carved itself into history. The moment was not polished, but pure. The crowd didn't just hear, it breathed with him. And when King ended with "free at last," the mall thundered with applause, tears, and awe. The speech, originally just one among many, had become a legend. But the march was never about a single voice. It was about people, families, workers, elders, students, who traveled miles in buses and cars, slept on church floors, packed homemade sandwiches, and came not to be seen, but to stand. They stood for jobs, for schools, for dignity, for the right to belong. And yet, even as hope echoed through the nation, organizers knew the road ahead was steep. Behind the harmony lay tension. Young activists pushed for faster, bolder action. Older leaders feared backlash. Unity, though real, was fragile. Bayard Rustin, the architect behind the scenes, carried both triumph and weariness. Women who had carried the movement were barely acknowledged on stage, and federal surveillance shadowed every step. Still, they had marched. And nothing, not threats, nor silence, nor politics, could unwrite what had been spoken that day. As the final words of Dr. King's dream faded into the late afternoon air, the march slowly unraveled. Not from disappointment, but from reverence. People lingered. They hugged. They prayed. Some just stood still, soaking in a moment they knew would never come again. Washington, for one brief day, had been transformed, not by power, but by presence. But history doesn't rest in applause. It moves forward in footsteps. The morning after, newspapers across the country splashed headlines like, "A monumental moment, and a dream for the nation." Photos of a peaceful, massive crowd filled the pages. But many editorials skipped over the demands, jobs, wages, desegregation, fair housing, and focused instead on the decorum. A safe frame. A digestible story. The dream was easier to print than the blueprint. President Kennedy, who had watched cautiously from the White House, called the march impressive. But the civil rights bill he had proposed still sat stalled in Congress. The Senate, choked by Southern resistance, refused to move. And so, the organizers returned to what they knew best, movement. Rustin drafted follow-up plans. King traveled, speaking and rallying. John Lewis returned to SNCC to organize the South. Every leader went back into the fire. Because they knew, speeches may stir the soul, but only struggle moves the system. Then came September. Just weeks after the march, terror struck in Birmingham. A bomb, planted by white supremacists, ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 girls were killed. Dozens injured. The explosion shook the nation and exposed the truth. Racism wasn't sleeping, it was raging. The dream had been spoken. But the nightmare was not over. Still, even in mourning, the march had planted seeds. It showed what peaceful protest could do. It gave lawmakers no more excuses to claim that progress couldn't be orderly. It gave children a moment to believe in. It gave elders proof that their time was not wasted. And it taught the world how change could march. But tensions grew inside the movement too. Younger leaders questioned King's nonviolence. Others worried the spotlight on him left too little space for grassroots voices. The unity that built the march, students, labor unions, churches, began to show cracks. Yet cracks don't always mean collapse. Sometimes they make room for new light. What's often forgotten is how many people made that march work. Volunteers who handed out water. Nurses who treated swollen feet. Mechanics who kept the buses running. Pastors who raised money in small towns so one more voice could travel. They weren't in the headlines. But they built the headline. As the seasons turned, the work continued. More protests. More jail time. More training in nonviolent resistance. More speeches. More sorrow. And still, hope held on. Because the march wasn't a conclusion. It was a turning. A reminder that progress, though slow, was real. When the last bus pulled away from the National Mall, and the chants gave way to quiet, something lingered. Not just memory, but movement. The march on Washington had ended, but the pulse it stirred was far from fading. Across the nation, in kitchens and classrooms, barbershops and church pews, people spoke differently now. With more urgency. With more faith. The dream had entered the bloodstream of America. But dreams alone could not pass laws. In July of the following year, President Lyndon B. Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It banned segregation in public spaces. It outlawed discrimination in hiring and housing. For the first time, justice wasn't just an idea. It was ink on paper. Then came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, securing the right that so many had marched and bled for. Neither of these victories came easily. But neither would have come at all without that summer day when 250,000 souls stood shoulder to shoulder and called the nation to account. Dr. King's speech became scripture for a new generation. Schoolchildren memorized it. Activists quoted it. But for King himself, the dream became heavier to carry. As war raged in Vietnam and poverty deepened in American cities, he expanded his vision. Justice, he said, must be economic. It must be global. And it must be brave enough to challenge power in all its forms. He paid for that clarity, with surveillance, with threats, and ultimately, with his life. But the dream did not die with him. Today, his statue stands near the tidal basin. Strong, solemn, facing the horizon. Etched in granite are words that once rang out across a restless crowd. Yet the truest monument isn't stone. It's action. It's the teacher reshaping lessons. The voter standing in line. The protester holding a homemade sign in the rain. The parent telling a child, "You matter." What began in 1963 ripples still. Through the cries of Black Lives Matter. Through the calls for justice in places like Ferguson and Minneapolis. Through the quiet determination of people who believe equality must not be inherited, it must be earned, again and again. The original marchers are aging now. Some are gone. Some are grandparents telling stories. But new feet march in their place. New dreams rise. Different in voice, but not in spirit. They come armed with smartphones and live streams instead of leaflets. But they carry the same questions. When will the dream be real? When will the promise be kept? The story of the march is not one of triumph alone. It is a story of beginning, of possibility, of courage planted in public, so it might grow in private. And as you close your eyes tonight, whether in comfort or unease, know this. The dream still waits. It waits in unfinished laws, unopened doors, unspoken truths. It waits in you. Because history doesn't end. It breathes. In silence. In marching feet. In whispered prayers. In the long, steady heartbeat of hope.